And so just to give an overview of the continuity of learning plan, I'll say that it may seem like we've actually spent more time in this remote learning platform than we actually have. I looked back at the calendar this week, and with the 2 week the two first weeks that we were out, which was March 16th to the 27th, so that was an emergency closure, and so we were not implementing an online platform over those 2 weeks. And then we started on March 30th, and then we also had a couple of days, 3 days of spring break. Technically, we've really only had this platform up and operating for about 2.5 weeks. So I know with us managing COVID-19, sometimes days seem longer and weeks seem longer, and I think months will seem longer, but it just hadn't been as much time as it feels like. So I wanted to preface that by saying the staff, just overall, central office staff, school office staff, have made some tremendous efforts to stand this up, and it has not been that much time in which the planning and the implementation of providing that remote learning platform has existed. And so with that, I'll just say for that first part, again, it was an emergency closure. So for March 16th through the 27th, we really focused on just providing resources to families, and that was our first attempt at making sure we did the paper copies to see how that worked for a lot of our system, and that's what we did for those 2 weeks. And so that was the time that we spent after those 2 weeks was over, just starting to build around teacher professional learning and developing a framework of an online platform that would work, which we launched on March 30th. And so we move on to slide 8, just to focus on March 30th and up to where we are today, which is in phase 1 of the continuity of learning plan. It really has been focused on making sure we did basic things like provide some options, and I say options because that's what they were, options of schedules to schools and to families, for them to look at what would work best for them, acknowledging that we have families that are working. We have different households where you may have younger children, older children, and we wanted people to really look at the circumstances and what works for them. And so we have combined a commitment to just looking at how we provide direct instruction, making sure there's also independent self-paced work, live check-in from students, making sure there are office hours. And for phase 1 of the continuity of learning plan, it really was making sure some of those logistical basic things were put in place to get everyone reconnected, and particularly in elementary, getting our students more focused on routine and trying to get them back into the normal of this is what we do in school and getting some instruction up. Secondary is a little bit different, and I just wanted to say that because even in a brick and mortar setting, when it comes to the end of a marking period in middle and high school, it really is students going back and checking to make sure they've turned in assignments, connecting with their teachers to see if there's an opportunity for reassessment and all of those things. So phase 1 was really primarily focused on taking care of a lot of those logistical and things to make sure we were able to wrap up third quarter in an appropriate way in middle and high schools. So I just wanted to emphasize that because as we work from March 30th to April 17th, and with spring break falling in the middle of that, it was really necessary for, at the secondary level, for there to be the office hours and the individual check-in with students to make sure all of those things were taken care of. And from that, we have really taken the lessons learned from phase 1. And as we wrapped up marking period 3 and questions and things came up around grades and all of that, we have committed to taking all of the learning from implementing this first phase 1 of continuity of learning and getting feedback from our teachers, our association leaders who are part of the continuity of learning plan, central office leaders, to say what did we learn from the implementation of phase 1 that we would like to address in phase 2. And so that brings us to where we are this week. And I call this the transition week of moving from phase 1 to phase 2. And this week, Monday started our very first day of fourth quarter. And so we worked yesterday with our teachers and students to make sure things were all put in place to wrap up quarter 3. And this week really is about, us really coming back and saying, we've gotten to the end of a quarter. What do we want to do in phase 2 that really focuses on, again, an online learning model and making sure there's independent and self-paced opportunities for our students, to make sure there's interaction with the teacher, and to make sure there's new content and assignments that are available at all levels and electives and for elementary and secondary. So I just wanted to make sure I emphasize that, because that's what phase 2 will be all about. And as a continuity of learning team, I'll say, we understand that COVID-19 kind of leaves us going by 3 to 4 weeks, and then us thinking and hoping we know what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And so we've also tried to map out, if there was an extension, what phase 3 would look like, and that would be an extended closure beyond what we just heard, to make sure that we are not waiting for someone to tell us what to do, but we actually have a plan in place if those circumstances happen. And so, again, phase 2 focuses on that online model of independent, self-paced work with teacher interaction, and there being new content and assignments and resources available to students at all levels, elementary and secondary. Another part of phase 2 that we started much communication with already is around grading and reporting for quarter 4. So last week we spent some time really collecting feedback, and I'll get into that in just a few moments. But a big part of starting phase 2 was starting fourth quarter. And so what I'm going to do is have a step back and deal with one more operational thing, and that relates to the school calendar options, because we did get guidance from the state about the 2 weeks that we were closed. The state forgave 5 of those days, and so 5 days still need to be made up for every jurisdiction. So I'm going to have Ms. McGuire talk about that, just so that we're clear on what our makeup days would be that would occur in this next quarter coming up. And then let's come back to finalize the continuity learning plan by having a discussion about grading and reporting. Okay? So with that, I'm going to transition really quickly to have Mrs. McGuire share the school calendar options with you, and then we'll come back to talk about marking period 4 and the grading and reporting plan after she does that. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Ms. McGuire.
Thank you. Thank you. And so, we wanted to just take a couple of minutes to talk through how we can structure our school calendar to reflect all these different phases and conditions that we've been speaking of. And beginning
Ms. McGuire, I'm sorry, this is Mrs. Evans. I wanted to make sure, Ms. Dixon, did you want to respond to Dr. McKnight?
No, I wanted to wait until their entire presentation.
Okay. Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't understand you. Okay, perfect. I'm sorry, Ms. McGuire, you can continue. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. No problem. So we have a number of options, and they begin on slide 9. As we all know, that all school systems in Maryland went into emergency closure conditions from March 16th through the 27th. And that resulted in a total of 10 non-instructional days that were not previously anticipated in the school calendar. As Dr. McKnight said, the State Board of Education last week on the 14th did waive the requirement for school systems to make up 5 of the 10 days, and that's a very helpful waiver to have. It leaves us with only 5 days for districts that need to make up instruction. And that will allow us to end the school year with 175 instructional days, which again will be very helpful. If we look at slide 10, we can walk through what those options are for us. MCPS in this year so far has only closed 1 day for inclement weather, and that was on December 16th. And we already, as a system, designated June 12th as a make-up day for that closure. Remember that we do have those days available to us because our regular calendar does schedule 2 additional days above the state-required minimum of 180. So we are very well positioned to make up the remaining 5 emergency closure days that occurred in March and still end the year on our previously scheduled date of June 15th. One of the steps that we already took in the system was to add instructional days on April 6th, 7th, and 8th. Those were able to implement those as part of the remote learning time. We did shorten our previously scheduled and to accommodate changing conditions. On April 28th, we had a scheduled day municipal election. However, that election is moved to June 2nd. It also will be primarily fill-in with no school impact. So as a result, we'll be able to schedule instruction on that day as well. And then we do have one additional designated makeup day that's going to be scheduled in the calendar, and that is June 15th. So together, those 5 days, 4 in April and 1 in June, do help us make up the 5 emergency closure days that we're required to make up, and again, still end on June 15th as planned. The innovative schools, those innovative schools are open for remote learning also on the days during the year that the traditional calendar is open, and those would be those 4 days in. So jumping briefly to slide 11. The next steps are that staff will revise.
Ms. McGuire, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make certain that everyone has their phone on mute so that we don't hear any background noises. Please. Okay, go ahead, continue.
Thank you. Just as a few next steps to summarize, we are revising the school year calendars to reflect the changing conditions and the approach that we're putting forward here. We're going to work with the state to document the actions that are needed to make up days due to the closure, and then we'll bring that back, all that information back to the Board of Education so that you can take action on adopted and revised school year calendars at your May meeting. And that concludes the review of the calendar. Thank you.
Ms. McGuire?
Thank you.
Ms. Evans, this is Jack Smith. May I make a comment?
Yes, sure. You may.
This is a perfect example of how I started this presentation with talking about complicated and complex. And in our typical world, we would use a very sequenced system for laying out our calendar, and it would go over several months. And even if we wanted to change the calendar or we were dealing with inclement weather, we would have started in February and started walking through this. But this is a good example, and it's instructive for all of us and all of our community members about, in the most complex situations, sequences change, the way we communicate changes, the way we do business changes, and it's just incumbent that we all stay together. And this is a good example of how the board has very much stayed right with the staff, and we've talked back and forth individually on telephone calls with each of you and sent you documents that laid this out, so we were able to, in the moment, make up these days. Otherwise, we would be having school on June 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and so I really want to commend the staff and really thank the board for this kind of work, because it really is what's necessary to deal with the complexity of this situation.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. It's a lot that goes into it, so we appreciate Ms. McGuire coming and presenting this information.
Thank you, Ms. McGuire, for that. And like we said, we'll be back in contact with the board to be able to make a decision in May as it relates to our calendar. Ms. Evans, if it's okay, we'll come back to the fourth marking period grading plan, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. And so this is the last part of our COVID-19 and continuity of learning plan update. And this really relates to us implementing a grading system for the fourth marking period. And so the last couple of weeks have been pretty busy in terms of us really making sure we have tried to gather as much input and sharing and discussion and conversation with a number of different stakeholders in virtual settings. We had a chance to connect with our principals, our councils on teaching and learning, board members, community groups, central office staff. Student leaders was another group that we heard from who gave us feedback. We got feedback from our grading and reporting work group of staff who already existed and have worked on this for a while. A special education advisory group we reached out to. So we just really spent some time trying to hear from everyone to gather many, many different perspectives about how we would proceed in quarter four with a framework for grading and reporting. And I say a framework because we were faced with a couple things. We knew that we extended third quarter to April 17th, and yesterday, Monday, April 20th, was going to be the first day of the fourth quarter. And Dr. Smith and I have been involved in lots of conversation with our stakeholders, and I know our teacher, one of our teachers said, one of the things we want to do is just make sure we at least know where we're going, because we want to try to do the best job at what it is we're expected to do. And so while we knew all of the grading and reporting components would not be figured out, because we wanted to work with the board around policy and all of those things, which we'll talk about in this presentation, our goal was just to solicit all that feedback to come up with a framework. And another connecting part for us was we also reached out to higher education institutions just to get a sense from them of what they were thinking of doing at colleges and universities, and also what they were thinking about how they would plan all of this out, in the future for students who were looking to apply to universities and so forth. And so with that, the framework that we came up with was to develop a system that was focused on a pass and incomplete model. And so that's the framework that we shared with our staff and community on Monday. However, that framework, again, has many other components that we need to engage in a discussion with that really will fill out the grading and reporting plan for fourth marking period. And so that's what we're going to share with you as we wrap up this part of the presentation with just exactly all the pieces of the grading and reporting plan for quarter four, so that the board will have the information it needs to be able to make some decisions. And so at this time, joining me in this discussion will be Dr. Navarro, Ms. Brenda Lewis, Dr. Lewis, Mr. Scott Murphy, Ms. Jennifer Webster, and Dr. Janet Wilson. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Navarro.
Good afternoon, board members. This is Maria Navarro. I am actually going to be referring to slide 13 as we move forward. As Dr. McKnight mentioned, we really did want to solidify a framing for how we move forward in these very unconventional times, to be able to provide our students with grading and reporting options that would be captured in their transcripts as they continue onwards and graduate and leave us and move on. So to start that work, we really needed to focus on some guiding principles. How do we organize this work? What is driving us for this work? And we knew that in this environment, and as you heard from Dr. McKnight talking about our phase one learning, we're learning every single day about how varied our students' experiences are and how do we best engage them. So our guiding principles needed to center around how to tackle grading and reporting with maximum flexibility, fairness, and equity, and looking at holding students harmless. And what we mean by holding students harmless is giving our policies and procedures a real look that serves the best interests of all students, knowing perfectly well that the environment that they are in right now is a crucial environment, and it's very different for a lot of families. And so it's not in many times it's not in the control of the students. So we wanted to make sure that as we think about how teaching and learning continues in this very different environment, how do we make sure that our framing and our thinking is holding opportunities for every student as we engage them into this work? And finally, for our seniors specifically, because they are going to be leaving us and transitioning into higher ed or into the work environment, we wanted to make sure that they are on track to graduate so that they meet all their requirements, and we are working through how to give the biggest flexibility and availability so that they meet this important milestone. As Dr. McKnight mentioned, we talked to everyone, our stakeholders, our parents and our parent groups that support multiple children, that support children in that have special needs, our families that are English language learners families, our families that have multiple students taking AP and IB courses. We talk to teachers, we talk to principals, we talk to students. And we also talked to other districts, and we looked at benchmarking, because benchmarking is important. As students transition out of MCPS and out of, frankly, nationally, all these high schools, higher education is really looking at also shifting their thinking and their flexibility to know that they're going to be gaining students from a variety of school districts that had to make changes to their grading and reporting structures specifically for these reasons. And so what we are coming to you today is with an initial framing that was developed based on the stakeholder engagement and the benchmarking that we heard. That initial framing is what we communicated to our staff, our community, and the school board, but that still has a lot of work that needs to be considered, and you'll hear a little bit about our thinking around finalizing marking period 3 at the secondary level, our lessons learned so far about the elementary learning environment, to really come forward with a final recommendation for board action for you on May 12th. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Brenda Lewis to go through what we learned and where our thinking is thus far in terms of elementary grading options. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Navarro. Good afternoon, everyone. At the elementary level, we had two options that we explored. The first option was a graded option in which a meets expectation or an in progress would be assigned within the areas of math and literacy. The second option that we explored was an ungraded option. The ungraded option was clearly the preferred option as articulated by our wide variety of stakeholders. This option ensures that our students will not receive a grade or have a value assigned that is based off of access to technology or access to home supports. This option also prioritizes the connection to and the engagement of students during our continuity of learning time. There was also grave concern expressed that the option of assigning a grade or a rating would exponentially marginalize our students who are already marginalized in a traditional school environment. There was also further concern that existed with respect to consistency. Assurances that meets proficiency and in progress would be the same ratings across all elementary schools. Our feedback that we heard was very clear that the priority during the continuity of learning time needs to be on the connection and engagement of students within their academic learning and ensuring that our students have the social emotional learning and supports needed to navigate during this unprecedented time. Now I will turn it over to Mr. Murphy, who will share with respect to middle school and high school.
Good afternoon, everyone. For middle and high school grading, as Dr. Navarro said, we have been benchmarking with other districts across the country with higher education and gathering a lot of feedback here in Montgomery County with all the groups that Dr. McKnight and Dr. Navarro mentioned. It is clear from the benchmarking and from the voices of our stakeholders that a traditional grading system that uses points, percentages, letter grades will not serve in the best interests of all students during this grading period of remote learning. So as was mentioned, we have developed a framework for what's commonly known as a pass-fail or pass/incomplete grading system for the fourth marking period, grounded in those guiding principles that Dr. Navarro mentioned, and ensuring that we're also thinking about student well-being, reducing stress, and avoiding anything that could negatively impact a student's academic standing. So based on this feedback, our framework for marking period 4 is to use a pass or incomplete grading system in middle and high schools. We are currently gathering more input to operationalize this system and establish clear criteria for what constitutes a passing grade. This will allow us to focus on engaging and connecting with students and also providing both academic as well as social and emotional support, with the emphasis less on points and percentages and more about providing meaningful feedback to students and parents. But for the calculation of the final grade at the end of the semester, which in a normal year takes the two marking period grades to arrive at a final semester grade, there are different options and ways that other districts are calculating final grades, some using pass-fail systems and others sticking with a letter grade for the semester. There is no perfect system, but based on the feedback we have received, our best thinking at this point is a preferred option of a pass-fail or credit-no-credit system for the semester in place of a traditional letter grade. Based on what we have heard, this approach is simply the most equitable by establishing a universal marker for all students at the culmination of this, what has been an unprecedented semester in public education. But as Dr. Navarro said, ultimately there are board policy implications, which we'll discuss in a couple minutes. And so we'll come back to the board at the next meeting with final recommendations and action. But I would like to just take a minute to share a little bit more about what we have heard here in Montgomery County about pass-fail versus letter grade approaches for the semester grade. Some stakeholders do want to maintain letter grades for the semester based on the grade that the student has as of marking period 3 or by allowing students a choice. Our worry is that by having a letter grade calculation at the end, it could then promote traditional grading practices throughout, which could exacerbate inequities, stress, and the pressure about grades in general in an already stressful time. Some systems and many colleges, in fact, are allowing students a choice to choose between a letter grade or a pass-fail. But we worry that any systems that rely on families opting in or out could prove advantageous for some, but disadvantage others. Another concern that often comes up, particularly for high school, is about student motivation, how grades serve as an incentive to keep students working. In a pass or incomplete grading system, it would still require that a student earn a pass for marking period 4 with clear criteria, again, that we're still in the process of gathering input around to develop. But it's also important to remember that not only are grades a motivator that keeps students engaged, but also relationships, expectations, and overall connection and engagement with teachers. It is true that in a pass or incomplete option for the semester, the cumulative grade point average, or GPA, would not be impacted, either up or down. So we understand the disappointment for some students who may have been working to improve their GPA this semester. But we have heard from our stakeholders that a universal approach for all would create conditions that ensure that no one is disadvantaged during this time. In talking with college admissions officers and watching admissions policies across the country, it also helps to inform some of our thinking. One major university system has said, this is a quote, "We are revising undergraduate admission policies to ensure high school students are not penalized by their inability to earn letter grades during the pandemic," unquote. And so we've also talked to other admissions officers in Maryland who always emphasize that there's a multitude of variables that go into admissions, like what a student profile looks like over multiple years, the courses they're in, and more about the complete package of what a student brings to the table. Lastly, I want to point out all the feedback we've been gathering that one of the most vocal groups has actually been our students. So I'd like to read a summary that I received from the Montgomery County Regional Student Government Association. Here's a quote from our students. "We feel that a universal pass-fail system is better than an opt-in or opt-out. An opt-in or opt-out could discourage students to use the pass-fail because some of their peers would elect to receive letter grades, and their peers would then have a relatively higher GPA than that student. A universal pass-fail would have the same effect on GPA or weighted GPA for all students, which is the most equitable in a unique time like now." The student continues, I'm still quoting, "Regarding the concern for students trying to show an upward trend for college admissions, we feel that colleges are aware of the unique hardship this semester and will be looking to other semesters and other metrics to measure academic performance. While there is a concern about academic distinction, we feel that a letter grade system would not fairly or accurately address this concern," unquote. Just to wrap up, I've also heard from a few other students about marking period 3, if that were used to make a letter grade, that it doesn't, some students feel that it doesn't accurately show their abilities, especially with the abrupt closure of schools in March and the period of remote learning to wrap out to wrap up the marking period. So, that's just our best thinking at this point, applying that universal system. But there's still questions that need to be answered, and those are part of our next step to gather more input on what's the transcript going to say, how will incompletes be recovered, what is the criteria, and of course, what is the learning recovery plan as we look ahead to the summer or to the fall. Next slide, 16, please. So next, we will be taking the time to gather input and carefully consider these implications and then come back to the board at the next meeting. By that time, we will have data about incompletes and overall grades for the third marking period, since actually grades are still in the process of being submitted this week for the third marking period. We will also have some of that criteria about what passing actually means, how grades could be reported on transcripts, and implications for things like GPA and student records. In the meantime, we have begun working on the framework of pass-fail for this passing complete for this marking period. So we know the community is anxious to know how the final grade for the semester will be calculated, but there's lots of perspectives, and it's important that we carefully study all implications and allow the board to consider specific policy matters. So before we discuss those policy considerations, I am going to turn it over to Ms. Webster to talk specifically about seniors and graduation requirements.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jen Webster. I'm one of the directors in the Office of School Support and Improvement, and we're currently engaged in analyzing the status of our seniors, our class of 2020, where they stand in terms of completing their course requirements when we look at the MCPS requirements and when we compare those to the MSDE requirements, which are slightly different. We want to be able to provide the board with information about where all of our seniors stand, looking at those two metrics. And we're working with our high schools now to look student by student for each of the students who we anticipated graduating this year, where they stand in terms of earning a C or higher for their courses needed for graduation. According to our current grading table, any student earning a C or higher in a course needed for graduation would have what they need in order to earn credit in that course. And so it's important for us to identify who the students are who have not yet completed their course requirements, who have not earned that C or higher. And so our next level of work is to work with our school-based well-being teams and our central office teams to support schools in working with students who have not yet met those requirements so that we can ensure that this continuity of learning period does not have a negative impact on our students in the class of 2020. And at this point, speaking of graduation requirements, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Dr. Wilson.
Thank you, Ms. Webster, for that introduction on what we're doing with our seniors in particular. My name is Janet Wilson. I am the interim chief of schools for Montgomery County Public Schools, and I would like to take a few minutes and talk about the differences between the MSDE, or those requirements that are driven by COMAR, and our MCPS graduation requirements. On April 14th, the State Board entertained a series of waivers, and one of the waivers that they did not put forth is a change in the COMAR requirements, which stipulate that 21 credits are necessary for our students in the class of 2020 to graduate. MCPS requires 22 credits to graduate. COMAR also stipulates that the local superintendent may waive additional graduation requirements in their school systems, because in Maryland, the graduation requirements across districts range from 21 all the way up to 26. So we do have some latitude here in terms of the analysis results that Ms. Webster spoke about to make some determinations about whether or not MCPS would want to use the default COMAR standard of 21 credits. The biggest difference, if you look in looking at this chart and focusing on the red, is in the area of mathematics. MCPS requires 4 credits for graduation for mathematics, whereas the COMAR standard is 3. Now, our students need to take math in each year of their high school experience, but the credit requirement varies between MCPS and our COMAR standard. The other difference is in the physical education area, where we require 1 credit and the COMAR standard is 0.5. The other differences, which really equate to the 21 to 22, really rest in the elective parts of our requirements. As you know, and just for the benefit of our public, when our students go through their high school course sequence, they are in one of 3 options: taking world language, 2 credits of world language, or 2 credits of advanced technology, or selecting a program of study, which, for instance, our human resource services or information technologies or our transportation technologies that are certainly part of our CPE pathways. And each of those options have a number of electives and also requirements tied to them. So as the board makes its considerations based on our class of 2020 analysis, we'll be bringing forth, as Ms. Webster said, a recommendation on whether we should apply the COMAR standard of 21 credits or hold to our MCPS credit of 22. Moving on to slide 19, policy considerations from the board. And as Dr. Smith and Dr. McKnight and Mr. Murphy all alluded to, we have received a significant amount of feedback and very thoughtful ideas and considerations for how we might approach the second semester. Also, people are wondering how we have room to depart from those aspects of IKA which guide our grading and reporting policy for MCPS and also its associated regulation, IKA-RA. As you know, because you receive yearly updates on our grading and reporting policy, it is quite effective in the context of normal circumstances when we're delivering a normal instructional program. It is considerable in its guidance on such things as grading, reporting practices that lead to making sure that students are being provided the necessary feedback on their instructional progress, also making sure that what we are doing and what the grades that we're using is an accurate reflection of student achievement compared to grade level and course expectations, and that it's a fair representation over time of students' performance. And given the time that we're in right now, a very demanding time, strict adherence to this policy is quite difficult given the variability of instruction in the online scenario that we're currently in. And our feedback that we've gotten from a multitude of families certainly supports that there is a large degree of variability in terms of the experiences with the online delivery. In addition, there is variability in the ability to access the instruction, not only due to the resources in each child's home, but also the circumstances, because we've heard from people that sometimes, and you heard this from Ms. McKnight, the time that students are actually engaged in the learning may be in the off hours due to circumstances in the home where children are caring for siblings and other such circumstances that make it very difficult. Also, another area that makes IKA difficult at this time is the inability to affirm the integrity of assessment. We haven't had an opportunity to fully plan and vet the methods of assessments in an online environment. So that is the current existing policy in the normal times, in the normal circumstances. And as I said, it's a quite effective policy. The other policy that is connected to the considerations of a pass, fail, or credit, no credit is in the policy ISB and its related regulation ISBRA. This particular regulation specifies that there can be no use of a credit, no credit, or a pass, incomplete, or pass-fail system applied to any course that's required for graduation by either MSDE or MCPS. So this will also come into play for the board's considerations on May the 12th when we bring forward some additional recommendations in terms of how we will view the credit, no credit, or in this case, pass, incomplete, or fail in terms of the third quarter. How does it interact with the third quarter? And also, how does it play out in terms of issuing a semester grade? Now, one would wonder, with these two policies in place, what latitude does the board have in order to make the necessary adjustments when we consider all of the circumstances that our students are in, when we think about the pass-fail being very foundational in the interest of equity and fairness to all students. And that brings me to Policy BFA. Policy BFA is really a policy-setting guidance, and in it, it allows the board to temporarily suspend all or part of any individual policy when there is a change in law or exigent circumstance with systemic implications. And if there were ever a demanding situation, we find ourselves in that right now. So Policy BFA gives the board the necessary latitude to make adjustments to both IKA and ISB when we bring recommendations to you in May. We also have to ensure that as we bring those policy change recommendations to you for the time that we're in, that we do have an explanation of how we're going to assign that grading. We have to be clear in how we're looking and going to calculate that final grade. We also need to make sure, per COMAR, that we have an explanation of that grade-changing procedure, because as the board knows, part of the policy right now is that we have a 45-day grade change policy rule that for some of our students actually may, in the situations that they're in, require that we have a little longer than 45 days to make a grade change. That is one waiver that MSDE did not present on April the 14th. MCPS feels strongly that that part of COMAR should be also suspended during this time. So as we look forward to May 12th, we will be bringing forward a more fleshed out menu of options for the board to take into consideration in terms of how we're looking at third quarter grades in relationship to the pass, incomplete, or fail, and what that final grade may look like on a transcript. So with that, I'll turn it to slide 20, which is we're opening up now for discussion about our COVID-19 presentation, especially specific to the continuity of learning piece.